Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for joining me for Roundtable. John Campbell, it's good to see you. Glenn, it's good to see you. Glenn Blaine, my former colleague, also my former colleague, Casey Snyder. Like, we've never worked together, so it's all right. Well, technically, you know, we all work together. It's actually been sort of a busy week, a little bit of a confusing week for me because I was in Western New York for some of it. So if you guys would be so kind as to fill me in on the tax cap, is there or is there not a deal? You want to start, Casey?
There is a framework agreement. That was the term of art that was being bandied about at Tuesday's press conference. But what's clear is that the sticking point that remains is just how any potential end date for the tax cap would be yoked in some way to the next expiration of rent control laws. Tax cap, of course, a huge deal for Andrew Cuomo and a very big deal for the Senate Republicans. Supporters are, of course, very suburban. The rent control law is very, very important to Speaker Sheldon Silver. And it's clear that Cuomo and Silver have come to an agreement on the linkage of these two issues that in January, Cuomo was very much against.
See, here's what I don't get. I don't get why Shelley Silver agreed to this. And you're working for the Daily News, so it's got a downstate focus. I mean, obviously, it's huge for his constituents, this rent control thing. But it seems to me that if, in fact, they end up, and it's not a done deal, right, because we don't know that Senate Republicans are going to sign off on this, but if, in fact, you end up with linkage between the tax cap and rent control, aren't we setting ourselves up for this exact same situation, a showdown in 8 years?
Sure. You know, but Silver wants a rent deal, and his members want a rent deal. And you know, there are a few things there are a few things that may get the Senate Republicans to move on a rent deal, and a property tax cap is one of them. So he may feel that this was a way to exercise some leverage over the Senate to get them to move on a rent deal. And
it seems dangerous to me, though. It seems like it's kind of a gamble, isn't it?
Well, it's a gamble either way. If he doesn't do anything, the Senate, there are many in the Senate who want to see those rent regulations go away.
Completely.
Right. And that would be just unheard of over in the Assembly. That would be an uproar in the Assembly. They're a New York City dominated conference. Many of their members, you know, their constituents depend on rent regulations. So that is a huge issue to Assembly Democrats. And for them not to have some kind of extension, and what they want is a strengthening of rent regulations, that would be a big issue for them. So this may be the only card that Shelley had to play in this battle.
So you, John, your newspaper is very ensconced in the suburbs. So do you believe that the senators, and there are a couple of, not a couple, there's a sprinkling of rent control departments actually in the suburbs, some on Long Island, some immediately north of New York City. Do you think that the senators in your neck of the woods actually care, are willing to move on this particular issue?
Well, you know, a good guy to look at is Jeff Klein, he represents part of Westchester as well as the Bronx too. So he's got renters and he's also got homeowners as well. And you know, what he told me was, I don't know why we always have to link these things. I support rent control. I support a property tax cap. Let's get them both done. But I think there is a general feeling in the Senate Republican Conference. We've got papers in Binghamton with Tom Libis and whatnot, and I think there's a general reluctance to link the two. And even, you know, George Mazion has said this week as well, over Rochester, Buffalo area senator. He said, you know, if the speaker is going to link rent control and a property tax cap to get rent control through, we should link UB 2020 to that. You know, there's something that the speaker's not acting on, and something that he'd like to see him act on, and it brings into question the entire concept of linking.
This was in response to a question that Glenn asked in the press conference on Tuesday, bringing up the question of linkage and what Cuomo said in January about how he didn't want it.
Yeah, the governor didn't seem so pleased.
Well, there was a bit of kind of very fast rhetorical footwork on the governor's part, where he said, well, of course, you could get into a semantic, you could make a semantic argument that all of these issues are linked. Well, I mean, that that's a very different game. Then, just as we were discussing, that you can link UB 2020. That, of course, was linked to the budget last year, or there was an attempt to link it. You know, how far are we going to go before you end up linking ethics, for example, to some of these issues?
And you also saw some of that semantic footwork when he was asked about the so-called sunset deal. I mean, his spokesman a few weeks ago, when asked whether, because the Assembly's been pushing for a sunset on the tax cap for a while, and his Cuomo spokesman Josh Vlasto a few weeks ago, when he was asked about this, said that was a non-starter, that the governor would not go for a sunset. Lo and behold, this legislation is announced. Cuomo signs on to it, and there's what most people see as a sunset. You know, it's tied to the expiration of rent regulations.
Well, as E.J. McMahon, though, has said yesterday when he was on the show, but he's talked to all of us, I'm sure, and he's been talking a lot about this. He actually consulted with the governor about this because it's a very important issue for him. He said, it's not really a sunset because we know the Assembly Democrats are never going to let rent control die. So technically, as long as you have rent control and rent laws, then you will have a cap. That's logical. Except in 8 years, you're going to have a showdown to see who blinks, which is exactly what we've got right now.
But the way the bill is written now is that, you know, the tax cap would remain in effect as long as rent regulations are in effect. That's the way it's kind of written in the language of the bill now. But Shelley, a day after he announced it, said, well, that's just the way it's written now. When we finally pass it, there will more likely be a hard date put in there. That it wouldn't be such a direct link to rent regulations. It would be the same date.
Which begs the question of why it was put into the bill language like that, unless it was to kind of float the balloon and see how it was greeted.
Some of this has to do with, as soon as there's an opening, as soon as Dean Skelos did not definitively say in the press conference, I love this, my chamber's going to pass it tomorrow. I think the Speaker smelled an opening, as did NYSET, because you're seeing the teachers union go whole hog to try and change this, because until it gets passed, it's not done. So I think the Speaker was like, oh, well, if it's still open, maybe I do want an exact date. Maybe I don't just want a little bit of a connection.
And you know, everybody talks about this being linked to the extension of rent regulations, but that's going to be a huge battle in the Senate and the Assembly. I mean, like I said, there are many in the Senate who don't like those rent regulations, and at best, the Senate is saying they'll just go along with an extension of the rules as they are now. There are many, many, many Democrats in the Assembly who feel that's just inappropriate. They want to strengthen those tenant protections. So this is going to be a huge battle. I mean, I see the rent battle now is sucking most of the air out of the room for the next couple of weeks.
Interesting. Well,
and whether or not there's a framework agreement, which and I think at least most legislators believe there will be a cap with this framework agreement. But, I mean, I think the thing to take away is it's far from over. You know, there's still a lot of details that need to be worked out, and you still have forces on both sides of it pushing and pulling to try to get their way.
And, of course, the rent regulations expire on
June 15th.
Yes. So there's a deadline there.
And that basically means that we've all been looking at, June 20th as the end date.
End of the session.
Now, it essentially means you've got to have a deal, you've got to have a pretty locked down deal on both of these major items in Cuomo's agenda, not by the 20th, but by the 15th.
But if one's right and it sucks all the air out of the room, that makes it a lot harder for the governor to get everything that he wants on his wish list, which is only 3 things, but it's like 3 of the hardest things. He sort of gave himself a very difficult task, I think, by the end of the session. And he very much wants the tax cap. The tax cap, he can get the tax cap and present it to the voters. I mean, you heard him. It will change the trajectory of the state. That's some pretty significant rhetoric. Then you could say, on ethics, you have an out. On ethics, you can say, they came to me with a deal that I thought was weak. And then I said, no, I want something strong. So you could see that he could get an out on that. Gay marriage?
It's kind of out of his hands in many ways.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I thought it was interesting, though, the unions are now signed on, some of them. And if they play hardball the way the Conservative Party is playing hardball, you could see this get very messy very quickly from a political standpoint.
Sure. But none of them have played hardball so far.
Not yet, it's true. However, the Teamsters president, Greg Floyd, was on the show last night, and I asked him about a litmus test. Will the unions say to candidates who seek their endorsement, and not just their endorsement, boots on the ground, money for phone banks, all that kind of stuff, will you say to them, if you don't vote yes or you didn't vote yes, we're not going to endorse you? He wouldn't go all the way there, although said he might consider it. And remember, the labor unions control the Working Families Party.
Sure, but you can't underestimate the power here of Mike Long, either the Conservative Party chairman. The Republicans have a very slim majority in the Senate. Mike Long has said this is a litmus test issue for the conservatives, and the last thing a Republican senator wants to do going into a tight race is lose the Conservative Party line. So, you know, that is a huge obstacle for the pro-gay marriage advocates to overcome.
My colleague Jimmy Vielkind spent a couple of days this week trying to get an interview with Roy McDonald, who's usually not a hard guy to get a hold of, you know, not laconic, right? And he did not want to discuss it, which can be read either way. Either he is willing to vote for gay marriage or not, but either way doesn't want to deal with weeks and weeks of being hammered more than he is already being hammered by advocates on both sides.
And playing off of Glenn's point, you know, you saw Mayor Bloomberg yesterday try to beat back the Conservative Party's anti-gay marriage stance, you know, by saying the Conservative Party beliefs, the conservative beliefs are you know, steeped in not having government involved with personal lives and whatnot, and it'll be interesting to see how that you know, if that works and kind of beating that back.
Well, he's been giving the Senate Republicans a lot of money over the years, right? He's their biggest single donor, and so maybe he's got. But the problem is, every time he comes up here, Mayor Bloomberg, he seems to stroke everyone wrong. I mean, he just hits every
he always leaves annoyed
every single time. It's amazing. He has this uncanny ability to do that. You know, the thing is that we shouldn't forget, and as you're mentioning, Glenn, they really want to keep the Senate majority, and they are the last toehold for the Republican Party. I mean, this is it for the Republican Party, which just keeps, and forgive me, but screwing everything up. Like New York 26, what happened there? I mean, we know what happened there. We were there, but it's so amazing to me that they were able to. I mean, just. Wow.
Paul Ryan. Were it not for the Ryan budget plan and its changes to Medicare, that would have gone a very, very different way.
True. I mean, but don't you think there could have been some other wedge issue that just as easily became, maybe it was choice? Because, you know, Jane Corwin said she would have voted yes to defund Planned Parenthood, and Kathy Hochul's 100% Planned Parenthood supportive of choice. I mean, I'm just saying you don't know.
I don't know if those issues would have brought in the kind of national money that ended up being poured into the effort on both sides, but also I think the fact that Hochul was just a much better candidate than Corwin was.
Yes, she was. You know, the governor didn't take as active a role as I thought he might.
Last couple of days, that was it.
Yeah, I'm wondering why. Although he's been playing a lot of things very safe, politically speaking. He did send Bob Duffy, who of course was the mayor of Rochester, and so is well known out there. But I was surprised because he could have claimed major victory in this particular one. And of course, he made Kathy Hochul. He was the one who put her where she was as clerk, and he had her. I don't know if you were there. You were definitely there at the state Democratic convention. She was one of his surrogates. Spoke to nominate him, and was a woman from a conservative area of upstate. You know, she was like the trifecta to nominate him. I was just. Really
She's a Gillibrandish figure in many ways.
Very good. Let's just briefly, before we run out of time, touch on this very interesting cooperation between the state comptroller and the state attorney general. I thought this was a little bit of a tweak to the governor. Do you agree? Okay, good. Good that I'm not alone in that.
Especially when you consider the fact that they only let the second floor know about it a couple of hours before the New York Times did a carefully leaked story about it on Sunday night. It's, you know, if I think the way I phrased it was the relationships are still evolving between those statewide elected officials.
That's very pragmatic of you.
Well, you know, I try, but
well, there's a general view around this building. Is that Cuomo wants to kind of expand his reach into areas that are generally controlled by other elected officials, and this was kind of viewed around here as a pushback by Schneiderman and by DiNapoli, saying, well, we can have our own little power too here. You know, you're not the only game in town.
Thank you very much.
And you've seen not necessarily criticism, but a lot of people pointing out that Cuomo has turned to the Inspector General on a lot of issues, on some that some could argue would have otherwise gone to the Attorney General.
Well, yeah, the one telling point was I think the Attorney General sent a letter to NYPA saying, hey, knock it off. That had to do with, if I'm not mistaken, using funds to fund nonprofits without an RFP. I think that's what it was about. And then, well, what do you know? The IG announces, oh, she's going to investigate NYPA too. So, you know, there is definitely some kind of a quiet turf war going on behind the scenes here. It'll be incredibly interesting to see how that plays out. And particularly what the AG and the controller come up with. If they don't come up with anything, then this is all just nothing.
Yeah, as Dave Grandow, who I know has been on the show a lot of times, said, it depends on what they actually do with this alliance. If it actually results in referrals and results in sort of joint efforts, especially if it results in joint efforts that affect the legislature or potentially the second floor.
Right.
That would be amazing.
And well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we should just also note, and if the governor doesn't get the ethics deal and he does do a Moreland Act commission, then you're going to have dueling investigations, which will be even more fun for all of us to cover, of course. I want to thank you very much. It's not going to be a quiet summer. Casey Seiler, thank you very much. Glenn Blaine, thanks. And John, thanks very much. John Campbell for being here first time. Hope you'll be back.
Thanks for having me.
Great to be here.
A lot of fun.